So today we're talking about brisket. Brisket is a great cut. When you buy it whole, untrimmed, just how it is now, this is what we call the packer cut. The packer cut has two muscles. Those muscles are the flat and the point. There's various synonyms for those names, but the most important thing to remember when you're talking about the point and the flat is that your point end, which is your larger end here, is going to have a higher level of fat. Have the flat end as well. The flat end is really good for pastrami. It's leaner. It has a little bit of a fat cap. If you want, you can get what we call a double cut. So the flat and the point are both single cuts. But if you want a double cut, it's a combination of both of those. Now let's say you're having a party, you don't know which cut to get. I always say if you have multiple guests, 10 people, and you're trying to decide what cut to get, you can get a combination of both, a double cut. If you really want something lean, you definitely want to go with the flat end. There are differences in prices if you get a double cut versus a single cut, but it's not drastic. Now the first thing you want to do when you're trimming is indicate where you want to start. I normally start where this big nugget of fat is right in here. That fat cap there is really just, I'm going to shave it a little bit. You can see a lot of it comes off. Save that fat. You can render that fat. You can definitely use that fat for sausage making. I then flip it, and you'll notice there's another kernel of fat that's right in here, and I really like to take that out because it helps me see the seam between the point and the flat end. And I'm taking my time. There's no race on this. You want to make sure you're removing fat, not just cutting into meat. And that's a lot of fat there. You can see it's got a ton of fat that just comes out of it. So just keep that in mind. If you're ordering that packer's cut, some people like to trim it. They want to practice on their own. Or some people just really love the fat. Just keep in mind that you want to make sure that you realize that there will be quite a bit of trimming even after you cook it. But for burnt ends, you can leave it as a whole pack of brisket, and it's delicious. Got a little bit of fat nugget up here. I'm going to trim this a little bit. Now, if I were doing just a whole smoked brisket, some people will say, hey, trim this to a 1/4 inch fat cap. That's very hard to achieve. You're going to see various points where I haven't even trimmed where it's super, super lean. You can almost see the meat right there in here. So I wouldn't trim too much around these areas. I might go in here and just feel. When I can squeeze the fat and kind of get a little piece out of it, I'll just cut that off like this. But I won't go any deeper because while some recipes say a 1/4 inch is perfect, there's not a perfect 1/4 inch fat surrounding the whole part of the brisket. So you can see here is lean, there is lean, it's lean in here. You can definitely go in between here if you like and trim some of that fat if you're leaving this whole. That's not going to affect it too much, just a little bit there. And I wouldn't trim any more actually, as crazy as it seems. It's just, all of that good fat is protecting this particular cut. And if you're smoking or braising or even stewing this thing or making ground meat, you want to keep that fat on there. It's going to make it more juicy. And if you don't like the fat after you cook it, you can always trim it off. But what I will say is a lot of the times, especially when you're braising or smoking, a lot of that fat renders off. It caramelizes, develops really good flavor. So just see what it's like after you've cooked it. You can see the bottom end here. Not much fat going on, so when I cook this, I actually cook this with this side down to make sure that that fat on the top end renders down. Not a lot of fat left on here though. We've taken out that nugget and it's good to go. So to separate it, you're separating this roast. You've never done this brisket. You don't know where to start. I actually start on the bottom end. So I flip it around and I just trim a little bit of fat. There's a seam in here you can't see, but I trim a little bit of fat. And if you look in there, let's see, it's a little more fat so you can see what I'm talking about. Someone's calling. If you look in here, there's a seam in here. I actually start with that seam, and that seam allows me to just remove that flat end from the point end without cutting into the meat. So I lift it up a little bit, and I'm kind of just pushing and move my knife forward. And you can see, you might hear a little bit of a ripping noise. And that's what you want. So you can see, you can even just start using your knife and just pushing against that point in. And as I'm doing, I'm looking to see, because the muscle is not super straight, it's gonna curve and change angles on me. So I'm just making sure that I'm not cutting into any meat. This is the part where you wanna take your time. You do not have to rush this at all. And be mindful that whenever you're cooking brisket for people, it may take a little bit of time, but it's definitely worth the effort. Now it does taper down at the end, so you just want to take your time and make sure you're really following that seam towards the end. It doesn't matter if it's perfect. You're not here to be perfectionists. Just, separate the two there. And now we have our point end and our flat end. This being our flat, that being our point. I am going to trim this up a little bit in here, just because now that I've separated it, so you can see how much fat is actually in between those two muscles. Now, like I said, not a tragedy if it's there, but if you now separated the two, or you're doing a smaller version of a brisket, you can definitely trim some of that down. Again, I'm just simply taking my knife and trimming fat only. It's all fat. I'm saving the fat because that's delicious stuff, really good for sausages or rendered fats or confits. Now, if you look at this point cut, it's got some fat on top. You've got a little bit of layer of fat. Some recipes say 1/4 inch. I think that's a good amount of fat to have. As you can see from the muscle striations to go this way, when you're actually cutting this, you'd be slicing this. You see all the muscles going out. You'd be slicing this against the grain this way as you cut. That's going to help make it more tender. If you go with the grain, if you slice it this way, you're risking getting more of a tougher brisket. Now we're back to our flat end. Our flat end, you can see the bottom end is fairly lean. So the top end here, I'm not going to trim too much because I want to keep that layer of fat to help protect it as it cooks so it doesn't dry out. And I'm just going to trim it layers at a time to make sure that I'm not going too deep. I'm feeling with my knife, and when you're cutting with your knife, you can feel the difference between protein and fat. This is actually a good thickness. It's not too much. Just about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch thick is really ideal. But you should be able to see fat on top of it. If you over trim it, it's not a tragedy, but you don't want to, if you can prevent it, don't trim too much. So we have our flat end, our point end. They both still have a good amount of fat, and as you can see, if you put those two together, we have our packer brisket. Now, the cool thing about this is, no matter what you're doing with brisket, whether you're braising, whether you're smoking, whether you're grinding it to make burger, it's a super flavorful cut. It comes from the front end pectoral area of the animal, which is right in here, so it often moves, builds a ton of flavor. So go low and slow in cooking, or grind it up, make a nice burger, whatever you like, and you're good to go. If you have any questions, visit us at SavanorsMarket.com. We have plenty of recipes, plenty of cooking techniques, and plenty of videos just like this. We'll see you there.